So we'll call it 6:07 then. We will crank up the regular Board of Directors meeting for Thursday, July 11th. And I would ask Director Baker to lead us in the pledge, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, and we'll let the record show that all the board is here with Director Barrett joining us via phone. Any additions or deletions for the agenda tonight? You probably know that, and the chief mentioned tonight that we're running short. And it's one of the reasons why that we need to take better care of the community needs, and that's why you all are here. And you see it demonstrated because Jacob got pulled away to cover a call, and that's the real world. So, but that also points out the very direct and very dramatic need that our district has. So I want you to know it's definitely not a setup. We didn't rehearse this. We're good, not that good, and. But it absolutely is the real situation. So with that, I want to say welcome to the most important part, no offense to anyone, of this meeting. And that's the part where you guys will, we're very grateful that you're with us. And this is, for those that were here 6.5 or so years ago, that was a very crucial time for this district. I would actually contend this is even more so. There's more people here. The community growth, and the needs are even greater. And so we thank you guys for joining us. We appreciate your participation. And in case Neil or anyone else may have indicated this is just a piece of cake. I'm speaking of cake, that it will just be cake and coffee. Not quite. We very much need your help. And as I was indicating to a few people earlier tonight, that's going to come in the form of really talking to your neighbors and really talking up the true need, why it's so crucial. It's really not an option. I mean, there are some things that are not optional. This is one. So we hope that we can count on you guys and many, many more who are not with us yet or necessarily on board. But we thank you guys very much for joining us tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn to our only new business item, I suspect, which has to do with the chief discussing and describing the mill levy needs and options and ultimately what we're proposing. So Chief?
Okay, thank you. So to kind of, provide a little bit of background to the current situation, the fire district went for longer than we have records at a constant mill levy of basically a little about 4.5 mills. And during that time period, there were numerous requests for mill levy increases that did not occur until 2013 when we passed a mill levy to bring it up to essentially 7.5 mills and on a temporary basis. And that mill levy increase was a 10-year mill levy increase, and it was earmarked for replacement of fire apparatus and renovation of facilities. And that mill levy did bring in over the past, we're coming on almost 7 years, roughly, well, over $4 million. And of that, about $3 million even went to purchase and replacement of fire engines and ambulances. $500,000 went into the renovation of the fire station. And that left about several $100,000 that we have utilized for purchasing protective gear for the firefighters. That mill levy we anticipated would carry us over a 10-year period, and and it probably would have, except for kind of two factors that have come up in the interim. One of those is the Gallagher Amendment, and the Gallagher Amendment essentially drops property taxes on a statewide basis whenever the total property taxes in the state would exceed 45% of the total, or residential property taxes would exceed 45% of the total property tax and mineral income in the state. So what happens whenever property values go up and oil prices drop is they have to decrease the rate at which property taxes are applied to residences. And that's happened now 3 times in the past 7 years. And that essentially has resulted in about a little over $350,000 decrease annually in our available budget. On top of that, over the past 6 years, the changes in Medicare reimbursement have, and the increase in the number of people that we transport that are on either Medicare or Medicaid have taken another about $60,000 decrease in the ambulance reimbursement budget at the same time that ambulance calls have gone up pretty dramatically, and calls in general have as well. Then on top of that, this year, while we like to see that wildfire seasons are not impacting our community, it also has been, one of our sources of income in that we essentially provide assistance to the federal government on a regular basis, and that has helped offset the cost of our equipment purchases. And this year, we anticipate that will fall probably in the neighborhood of 80% from last year. So
80% less.
80% less, yeah. That has kind of put a bit of a crimp in the budget. So, as you look through here, those are the primary issues that have created the current situation. But our current situation is that we did anticipate utilizing about $250,000 out of reserves this year. And again, that was because of that $350,000 decrease that we have seen from the Gallagher Amendment. And on top of that, we are going to see an additional decrease because of the lack of fire reimbursement funding. As mentioned, we are currently going to, eliminate the 2 positions that we have lost by attrition. If we lose 1 more position, we will also not fill that, and we will try to keep the daily staffing of firefighters at 2 rather than 3. In comparison to other fire districts, that is well below the staffing level of any of the other departments in our range. You'll see on this report that this is a listing of every fire district in the Front Range that is anywhere from 50% to 200% of our call volume. And you can see that our staffing levels are dramatically below all of them. You can also see that the biggest reason for that is that our current mill levy is also the lowest in the entire Front Range. The next lowest in the area is South Metro with about 2 mills higher than we are, and they actually are able to function on that largely because of economy of scale. That's a massive fire department. I believe it's the 2nd largest in the state now, and they also have a considerable amount of other enterprise funding that comes in addition to that. In comparison to the fire districts up here in the foothills, all of our neighboring departments vary from 12 mills up to over 14 mills as compared to the 7.5 that we're operating on. So, our closest and probably most comparable neighbor is Platte Canyon Fire, who has double our staffing for about a third less calls. That's probably a more appropriate staffing level for where we're at. The biggest issue that we've got is we moved up to 3 firefighter paramedics per shift, largely because that allowed us to send an ambulance down the hill with two persons on board and keep a paramedic back so that for the second call, we would be able to have a paramedic and then pick up volunteers for driving the ambulance or staffing it. Unfortunately, as mentioned, the number of times that we have 2, 3, or even 4 calls going on at a time is up hugely. It was pretty much over the last week, we probably had 15 episodes where we were up to 3 calls at a time and trying to run that with just really a skeleton crew. So, our current situation is not really where it needs to be in order to provide, the basic services to the community. The issues that we're really looking at, in order to get our funding back up to where it needs to be to maintain that staffing level of 3, we would have to cover that $252,000 from reserves that we took this year. And we would probably have to stop trying to rely on fire reimbursement funds to make up the rest of it. That, basically replacing at a minimum that, $420,000 between ambulance revenue and Gallagher, plus looking at the, minimum of $100,000 that we're not going to get in reimbursement this year. Is essentially this year's shortfall, and going into next year we anticipate that it is not going to get any better. Going into this next year, we're going to see a very small decrease in because of the Gallagher, a little under 1%. And right now we do not have numbers for the property value increases from Jefferson County, but we do have Park counties, and they reported an initial increase of 14% before appeals. And historically, we anticipate that 14% will probably fall to 9% at the end of the year. And then again, a little under 1% decrease for Gallagher. And then we're dealing with essentially 3% per year inflation, which means that essentially at best we would be flat compared to this year's income going into next year and the following year. Following that, the projections are that there will be, unless the state comes up with a constitutional change to the Gallagher amendment, there will be another larger decrease. So they pushed off a 15% decrease this year by basically, pushing the numbers off and estimating future revenue. But they can't do that beyond a 2-year cycle. So that currently still, unless they come up with a fix, means probably another 10% decrease in the budget going into 2022. Of course, if we don't do something about the mill levy, that's probably not that important to us, because the 10-year mill levy will also expire at that time. And when that does, then we're going to have to basically, if the district has not come up with a different funding solution to that, we will have to essentially drop back to being a volunteer fire department with no ambulance transport service, because we would not have the funding to continue that. So and of course, the funding that we did get in the last mill levy paid for replacement of a considerable part of the fleet that we have. However, moving forward beyond the next 2 years, it does not continue to pay for that. So We're currently behind on replacing 2 ambulances. And right now our ambulances are getting about 30,000 miles a year going up and down the hill. And obviously we don't like to keep them over 200,000 miles. They really start to break down a lot. And as it is, the mechanics are over here 3 or 4 times a week fixing things back up again. So the estimated cost moving forward for replacing equipment is essentially still the money that was generated from the last mill levy to continue to replace that. And you know, a big part of that is because the cost of a fire apparatus is just getting astronomically expensive. Ambulances have gone from being about 125,000 4 years ago to about 250,000 now. And fire engines, bargain fire engines start at 500,000 and go up from there. We're not even going to discuss what the cost would be of adding a ladder truck if we end up needing that because of future development, because it is just so far out of range for the fire district that even if the county approved development to the point where it pushed a need for a ladder truck up here, I don't see anything happening in the next 10 or 15 years that would fund that cost. Because essentially that's a cost of about $1.5 million up front, about $100,000 a year in maintenance and testing, and then obviously the staffing and training, which just gets into numbers that we don't even want to talk about. We have also been pushing off a lot of the facility maintenance. The parking lot here's the obvious example. 2 years in a row we tried to budget money to repair the potholes and resurface the parking lot, which is, we were originally estimating about $25,000. It's probably going to go up considerably from that. We've had to pull that money for other repairs. We still haven't fixed the roof here. We're going to need to do that. And then obviously the other 3 stations have been getting almost no attention. So they're gonna need significant upgrades over the next several years. And then along with that, one of the things that I think that we need to look at doing, if possible, to keep our long-term costs reasonable is to modify those stations so that we can have volunteer residents in them. So essentially get resident facilities where we can bring in volunteers to live at the fire station for essentially free rent in exchange for volunteering. It's a very cost-effective way to go, but it will take a considerable upfront investment in terms of building those facilities because all of the other stations are obviously nothing but garages currently. Those would be very useful in helping to augment our current volunteer pool. While we have very good volunteers, the reality of it is that once you hit 4 or 5 or 6 calls a day, volunteers don't come out for that. They'll come out for a couple of calls a week, but once we start getting into those numbers, we have to rely on staff that's here at the station to be able to handle that, and or staff that live at a fire station that could pick up at least some of that call volume. And we've seen that with our response to structure fires, because we've had so many structure fires this year. It used to be that every time you had a structure fire, when you had one every 2 months, every volunteer would come out and fight those fires. When you start getting into having a week where you have 3 structure fires, as we did this winter, they have jobs. They can't spend 6 hours a night putting out fires and then go to work in the morning. So we get a couple of volunteers that may, for example, come out at 2 o'clock in the morning because they have the following day off. But if it's the middle of the week, people have jobs. Monday through Friday, during daytime hours, we don't have a lot of volunteers that are available. The ones that we do have are largely folks who work on ambulance services down in town, and so can put in occasional daytime hours when they're off shift up here. But by and large, the average person no longer has the ability to come out and, respond to the number of calls that we're having. Another issue, obviously, that we're having has come up with the loss of the 2 firefighters that we've had who have taken other jobs. We are not competitive with other fire districts in the area. And by not competitive, I mean by a lot. So, for example, South Metro Fire starts a brand new firefighter with no experience at a salary higher than I make. The firefighter that's leaving to take another job is going to be looking at a good $20,000 increase to drop back from a lieutenant here to a line firefighter, starting firefighter there. So if we can't pay a living wage, we are not going to be able to retain the staff that we do have in the future. And I know that a number of our staff are waiting to see how the future of the department goes to make their decisions about whether they will, look at higher paying jobs in other locations as well. So we are going to have to address that at some point in the future, moving ahead. One of the other issues, well, there's several others on here that we're going to have to look at funding for. Obviously, we're fixing the cistern, the water system at this one location. We have significant issues with trying to have adequate firefighting water supplies throughout the district. That's been an ongoing issue for a long time, and one that unfortunately I don't think we're going to be able to remedy without some significant funding into coming up with water sources in other locations. And obviously, a couple of the programs that we have that are very popular, that we started on grant funding, we will not be able to retain if we do not have the grant funding going into the future. So after this season, when the chipping funding has ended, that program will have to cease unless we have another funding source for it. And likewise, the mitigation crew is so far able to fund itself, but we will have to look at that moving into the future, because we can't gamble on having a season where we have to subsidize that program moving into the future. And then probably the last one that we have to address is Aspen Park. This station was located because it is central in the district, and as a one-station department, essentially, it's probably a reasonable place to put it. But when we look at our call volume, a considerable amount of it occurs down in the Aspen Park area. And we have a volunteer station down there, but we have only 4 volunteers assigned to that station. And the average response on calls in that area is less than 1. So we basically only get those volunteers when we have depleted all of the resources out of this station and are making multiple calls for volunteers to come out. And unfortunately, of the volunteers that are assigned to that station, none of them actually live very close to Aspen Park. They're all coming in from, at a minimum, a couple of miles away. So while it's a great location as far as what the community needs, it's not a very great location in terms of the fact that we can't get apparatus out of it on a very consistent basis. If growth continues to occur in the area, that station at some point is going to have to be staffed to be able to handle the increasing call volume. And that's regardless of whether we see these larger projects come in the future or not. Our call volume has been going up between 5 and 12% a year consistently, and the acuity of calls has also been increasing. So it's just a tremendous number of car wrecks that take up a lot of resources. Obviously, increase in the number of structure fires and an increase in the number of wildland fires as well. Even though this year is an anomaly, I don't expect that to continue over time, given the way that's gone. So I've given you a number of options to consider here. And one thing I want to point out is that the board does not have to make a final decision on any of these specific recommendations here tonight. But what you do have to decide is whether to move ahead to have a mill levy placed on the ballot in November. So that has to be, we have to notify the county by the 26th if you make that decision to move ahead. But I want to make sure that you have those options in front of you. So the first option is moving ahead is that if the district does not get a mill levy and the 2013 mill levy sunsets, we will essentially see the incoming property tax drop by over $700,000 a year. And that will essentially mean that we will have to drop back to having basically one paramedic per day on call or on shift. Other than that, we would have to rely on volunteers, and we would not be able to maintain or replace the equipment at the volunteer stations moving into the future. So essentially, we'd have to try to run as an all-volunteer or almost all-volunteer station or department again. If at the time that mill levy expires, a replacement mill levy for the same amount were to be renewed, we would still have to drop our staffing back to 2, and we would have to at least close one station, and we would have to basically run essentially one ambulance. And if we have more than one call at a time, then essentially they'd either have to wait or get a private ambulance to come up from Golden. Those would be the options. If we look at a 1 mill levy, that would replace about 50% of the lost staffing. We would be able to essentially continue to replace equipment that we have currently and maintain the staffing of 2 per shift. A 2 mill levy increase would allow us to keep the previous staffing of 3 paramedics per day. So that would be the minimum amount that we would have to keep the service level at where it was 2 years ago. 3 mill levy would also allow us to, fix the roof at the station and, be able to essentially maintain those facilities and start adding resident facilities over time. And so what we would essentially do with that is basically like put up some double wide trailers on the property, because that would be the only cost-effective option at that point. It would not be building a typical nice fire station. What we found with construction costs of fire stations now is that when we started penciling out what it would take to put in a full like fire station in Aspen Park, I would not estimate less than $5 million for the whole project, because we would need to look at 5 acres of land for parking and apparatus. We would be looking at upwards of $500 a square foot for construction, and that adds up pretty quickly. And I think by the time we got around to doing it, $500 a square foot would be too low. So going up to a 4 mill increase would get our staffing up to 4 per shift. That would still be below the staffing levels of any of the other departments of our size in the area, but it would essentially allow us to staff a second out ambulance at a time. So we'd be able to send an ambulance down the hill and still have a staffed ambulance to respond to calls. And beyond that, and that would take us about to the funding level that our neighboring fire districts have. Beyond that, if we wanted to look at replacing Station 4, that would also require a bond issue at some point in the future to fund that. And I think that would probably have to be looked at as a separate issue. So that's kind of the analysis of where we are. And again, you do not have to decide on the exact options to choose moving forward, but you do have to make the decision tonight over whether or not to pursue a mill levy in November.
Chief, I have a question about the Gallagher amendment. With the state fire chiefs, what's the take on having that perhaps repealed, eliminated, and through the state legislature? And if that was to happen, would that be a benefit for us in some terms of financial reward?
It would not change our current situation other than eliminating that future 10% additional decrease, because it would not restore past funding. As far as a legislative fix, they have come up with a number of ideas on that, but it still appears that in order to come up with a fix that will work over time would require a constitutional amendment. Colorado is an unusual state in that tax code is incorporated in the state constitution. So when the Gallagher Amendment was put in place, it was an amendment to the state constitution. And amendments to the state constitution require a vote of the people in Colorado. So it would require convincing the people of Colorado to essentially agree to forego tax cuts in the future for residential property. I do believe that in the long run, it would be a benefit to the people of Colorado and especially to the business community, because one of the problems with the Gallagher Amendment is that over time it has gone from a business paying 20% more than a residence in property tax to now a business pays 400% of the amount that a residence does. And I don't think that that's a very economically feasible way to approach taxation. But that's not my decision, and I'm saying that as a personal impact on that. So my take on that is that they may come up with some short-term ways to reduce the future impact, but not to eliminate the problem or to reverse what has happened with those cuts in the past.
And again, to clarify, we as a board just need to make a determination if or if not, we choose to announce to the county that we would like.
That's
or
right.
not like.
So no later than Friday, July 26th, we have to let them know if we are going to be requesting a levy lift and putting that on the ballot for November.
But we do not need to make a determination
Nope.
at this time.
Nope.
What number,
Correct.
what value, what level.
Correct, and I actually would go so far as to say, I think, if we had to, could we? Yes, I believe we could. Would it be prudent tonight? I don't believe it would. I think we need to have additional discussion and we have time to do that. Yeah,
And public comment. as
correct,
well.
correct. Yeah.
Well, if it pleases the board, am I getting ahead of myself?
No.
Before you do, let me just make a couple points if I could. First of all, obviously, it's a very serious matter. I try to look for moments that I can have it be a little less serious, so I'm gonna take a shot at one, and then I'll get more serious for a moment. But I kind of feel like this is a Rodney Dangerfield moment to some degree. And by the way, Chief, I do want to say thank you very much for, and Jacob and many others, for the time involved and the very, very thorough presentation and description of options and so forth. I think it's outstanding.
Thank you, Chief.
And we are, hopefully I can say this, damned fortunate to have you guys representing us. And anyway, I was going to say, it reminds me of a Rodney Dangerfield thing when, because of the the dire situation that we're faced with, it's like you want a second opinion. All right, you're ugly too, you know. So it's like it's a challenging time. Obviously, it's very apparent, and I don't know if you'll agree, but I'd like to just put this out there because not everyone was either here or on the board 6+ years ago, but that mill levy was very, very different. It was also super critical, but it was very, very different. As you heard the chief describe, that was largely really more focused on equipment needs. Obviously, some other things were done and were needed, but it was mostly equipment focused. I think this one is quite different. As you've heard, this is a really serious matter. And we have a number of people representing this community sitting in the back of the room who actually provide the service. Hopefully you never see them. Hopefully you never need them. But if you pick up the phone, you want to know that they're there and that they will be there. I'll use the word again, damned quick. And in order to do that, in this mill levy, I see that people come first. That's the real top priority. Certainly there's some additional equipment, as you've heard the chief describe, and some additional facilities funding. But I believe that it's a great extent focused on the current people and then the need for additional people. I mean, would you like to comment on that? I mean,
I totally agree. I mean, without the staffing, none of the rest of it's gonna do us any good. So we have to keep the staffing up to make sure that we can roll that equipment out.
all right, so one last thing before you
Yes, sir.
go where you want to go. I want to just ask you a question. I was going to pop over there, but I'll just do it. It's just fine. So for us to ultimately vote on whether we go forward for July and carry this forward or not, once we finish that and then turn to old business, obviously the next item is citizen issues. Are we okay to then ask for feedback? We are, aren't we? Isn't that
Absolutely.
all is good? Okay, good. I just want to be sure. I want to do that, but I just wanted to be sure that I was all right to do that. Okay, cool. Any other questions, comments from the board? And if not, do we have a motion
I'd be
regarding?
honored to make the motion that
Okay.
the Elk Creek Fire Protection Board notify Jefferson County that we will be looking to increase our mill for fire protection.